They didn't catch him with fingerprints. They didn't catch him with DNA. They didn't catch him because someone saw him. They caught him because he corrected the detective. Just 7 words. 7 words spoken calmly, without anger, without panic, and in that moment, the entire investigation changed direction. The detective didn't react. He didn't interrupt. He didn't accuse. He simply stopped talking. Because the man sitting across from him had just revealed something only the killer could possibly know. This is not the story of a loud confession. There was no shouting, no dramatic breakdown. This is the story of how silence, arrogance, and one small mistake destroyed the illusion of the perfect crime.
The scene that didn't make sense. When police first arrived at the house, nothing looked wrong. The front door was locked, the windows were intact, no signs of forced entry. Inside, the home looked lived in but not disturbed. No drawers pulled open, no furniture overturned, no shattered glass. It was the kind of scene detectives describe as too quiet. Because real crimes are chaotic. People panic, they rush, they break things. This crime didn't look rushed, it looked controlled, and that made investigators uneasy. The victim. The victim was someone ordinary. No known enemies, no criminal history, no dramatic lifestyle. Friends described them as predictable, routine-driven, careful, which made the crime even harder to understand. There was no obvious motive, no financial distress, no recent conflicts, no signs of obsession or stalking. Whoever did this didn't act out of desperation. They acted out of certainty. Time of death. The medical examiner narrowed the time of death to a specific window, a few hours late at night. That detail would later become crucial because during that time window, very few people could reasonably claim access, and even fewer could explain why there were no signs of struggle. The killer hadn't surprised the victim had let them in. Why this was not a random attack. Detectives rule out random attacks early. Random attackers leave chaos, they leave evidence, they leave unpredictability. This crime had none of that. The killer knew the layout of the house. They knew where things were. They knew how to move quietly, which meant this wasn't chance. This was familiarity. The first theory and why it failed. Initially, investigators considered burglary, but nothing was missing. Electronics untouched, wallet still there, jewelry untouched. Burglars steal. This person hadn't, which meant the goal was never theft. The goal was the victim. The most dangerous assumption. There's a dangerous assumption people make about killers. They imagine them as emotional, explosive, uncontrolled. But the most dangerous killers are calm. They plan, they wait, they rehearse. And this crime felt rehearsed. The list gets short. When police focus on familiarity, the suspect list shrinks fast. Friends, family, partners, co-workers. People who had been inside the house before, people who knew routines, and one name appeared again and again, not because of evidence, but because of proximity. The man no one suspected. He wasn't aggressive, he wasn't strange, he wasn't secretive. People described him as polite, helpful, quiet, the kind of person who blends into a room, which is exactly why detectives paid attention. Because people who blend in are often trying to not be noticed. The call from police. When police asked him to come in just to talk, he didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't ask why. He agreed immediately, even sounded relieved. That reaction alone told detectives something important. Innocent people fear being blamed. Guilty people fear losing control. And this man believed he was in control. Why he believed he was safe. He had planned carefully. No witnesses, no forced entry, no obvious motive, and most importantly, he believed he had mastered his story. Every detail memorized, every timeline rehearsed. He wasn't worried about questions. He was confident in his answers. What he didn't understand. He believed interrogations were about facts, but interrogations are about behavior. They're about tone, pauses, reactions, And most of all, they're about what someone says when they think no one is listening closely. To understand how this interrogation unraveled, you first have to understand the man sitting in that chair. Not the version he presented to police, not the polite, cooperative image he carefully maintained, but the person underneath it. People often imagine killers as impulsive or emotionally unstable, as people who lose control in moments of anger or panic. But the most dangerous individuals are rarely like that. They are patient, they are organized, and they are deeply confident. Confidence is what allowed him to walk into the police station without hesitation. Confidence is what made him believe he could control the narrative. He wasn't afraid of questions. He wasn't worried about details because he had already rehearsed them. Long before the crime, he had begun imagining this moment, the questions, the answers, the way he would appear calm and reasonable. In his mind, the interrogation was not a threat. It was a performance, and he believed he was prepared. The difference between innocent people and guilty ones is not nervousness, it's predictability. Innocent people remember fragments, they hesitate, they correct themselves. Guilty people build timelines. They remember exact times, exact movements, exact sequences, because lies require structure. And his story had structure. He knew what time he claimed to arrive home. He knew what time he said he made a phone call. He knew which details sounded believable and which did not. What he didn't realize was that this level of precision is often the first warning sign. Real memories are messy. They don't move in straight lines. They drift. But his story didn't drift. It marched forward, step by step, exactly as planned. This wasn't memory. This was rehearsal. And the more he spoke, the more obvious that became. What made him especially dangerous was not intelligence, it was ego. He believed he was smarter than the detectives, smarter than the system, smarter than anyone who might question him. He believed the absence of evidence meant safety. No fingerprints, no forced entry, no witnesses. In his mind, the lack of chaos proved his success. But what he didn't understand was that calm crimes attract attention because violence usually leaves disorder. When a scene is too quiet, investigators start looking at the people who had time and control. He had both. As the interview continued, detectives noticed something else. He didn't ask questions. Innocent people often want reassurance. They ask what's going on. They ask what police think happened. He didn't. He assumed he already knew, and that assumption would later cost him everything. He spoke comfortably, even casually. At times, he offered information that wasn't requested, small details meant to sound helpful. But every extra detail is a risk, because lies don't fail all at once. They fail in moments. A word too precise, a correction too fast, a reaction that comes before thought. He believed silence was dangerous, so he filled it. And that was exactly what the detective wanted, because silence makes confident people talk, and confident people eventually reveal what they know, even when they don't mean to. By the time the detective casually shifted the conversation toward the crime scene, the suspect believed the interview was going well. He felt relaxed. He felt safe. He felt in control. And that false sense of control is what made the next moment inevitable. Because when someone believes they've already won, they stop guarding their words. And when that happens, the truth has a way of slipping through.
The interrogation room didn't change. The walls stayed the same, the table stayed the same. The camera kept recording quietly from the corner. But the dynamic inside the room had shifted. The detective wasn't there to accuse him. He wasn't there to argue. He was there to listen. The most effective interrogations rarely feel aggressive. They feel conversational. That was intentional. The detective began by asking simple, almost harmless questions. Not about the crime, not about the victim, about routine, where he usually parked his car, what time he normally went to bed, what he liked to do after work.
These questions served a purpose. They created rhythm, and rhythm makes people comfortable. As the suspect answered, the detective watched carefully, not just what he said, but how he said it, how quickly he responded, whether he paused, whether he corrected himself. The suspect rarely paused. He answered immediately, confidently, almost as if he had been waiting to say these things. That confidence continued as the conversation slowly drifted closer to the night of the crime. The detective didn't rush it. He asked about the suspect's day in small pieces, morning, afternoon, evening. The suspect followed along easily. He described his movements with precision, times, locations, transitions. It sounded convincing, but it also sounded rehearsed. At one point, the detective intentionally interrupted the timeline. He asked a question out of sequence. The suspect adjusted instantly. No confusion, no hesitation. He simply corrected the order and continued. That ability to adapt should have made him look smart. Instead, it made him stand out. Because real memories don't rearrange themselves that cleanly. They resist, they hesitate, they break. His didn't. As the interview progressed, the detective began using a subtle technique. He introduced minor inaccuracies, nothing obvious, just small, almost forgettable details. A time slightly off, a location slightly misplaced. The suspect corrected some of them. At first, that seemed helpful, but corrections are dangerous because they reveal what someone is certain about, and certainty is often built on experience. The detective mentioned that the victim had been found in the living room. The suspect nodded. The detective continued speaking, keeping his tone casual. He described the scene briefly, vaguely. Then he slipped in a single detail. He said the victim had been found lying face down. The suspect reacted instantly, not emotionally, not defensively, instinctively. He corrected him. He said the victim was on her back. The words came out smoothly, confidently, as if correcting a simple mistake. There was no pause, no realization, just a reflex. The room went quiet. The detective didn't react. He didn't look up. He didn't challenge the statement. He simply stopped talking. Silence filled the room, and in that silence, the suspect realized what he had done. His posture changed. His shoulders tightened. His breathing became shallow. For the first time since the interview began, he stopped speaking because he knew. That detail had never been shared publicly. It hadn't been in the news. It hadn't been discussed with friends or family. Only investigators knew how the body had been positioned, and now so did he. The detective waited. Silence is powerful in an interrogation. People feel compelled to fill it. But this time, the suspect didn't. He sat still, thinking,
replaying the last few seconds in his mind, trying to find a way out, but there was no clean exit. Once a detail like that is revealed, it cannot be taken back. The detective calmly acknowledged the correction, not as an accusation, as a confirmation. He asked how the suspect knew that. The question wasn't confrontational, it was simple, and there was no good answer. The suspect tried to recover. He said he must have heard it somewhere, maybe someone told him, maybe he read it, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him, because moments earlier he had been certain. That contrast mattered. Confidence followed by doubt is revealing. From that moment on, the interrogation was no longer about gathering information. It was about observing collapse. The detective began revisiting earlier statements, not aggressively, methodically. He asked the suspect to repeat his timeline. Small inconsistencies emerged. Times shifted. Details softened. The story lost its structure. The suspect grew quieter, more careful. But caution came too late, because the foundation of his story had already cracked. Every lie rests on the assumption that no one knows the truth. The moment that assumption disappears, the lie begins to fail. The suspect could feel control slipping away. He had entered the room believing he was ahead. Now he was reacting, and reactions reveal far more than rehearsed answers ever do. The detective didn't push for a confession. He didn't need to. The mistake had already done the work. All that remained was to let the suspect sit with it, to let the weight of that single correction settle in.
Because sometimes the most damaging moment in an interrogation is not the confession, it's the realization that the game is over.
Once the mistake was made, nothing in the room needed to change. The detective didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He didn't threaten. He didn't have to, because the suspect already understood what had happened. The confidence that had carried him into the station was gone. In its place was calculation. He began choosing his words more carefully, pausing longer before answering, offering fewer details. But restraint can be just as revealing as confidence. The detective continued calmly, revisiting the timeline one piece at a time. He asked the same questions again, hours apart, using slightly different wording. At first, the answers matched. Then they didn't. Times shifted by minutes. Actions were softened or removed. Certainty faded into approximation. The story that once felt solid now felt fragile. This is how lies collapse, not with drama, not with shouting, but with fatigue. Maintaining a false narrative requires constant attention. Every detail must be monitored, every word checked. The longer an interrogation continues, the harder that becomes. The suspect began contradicting himself. Small things at first. A door he said was locked became a door he couldn't quite remember. A phone call he claimed was made at a specific time became something he thought happened earlier. None of these contradictions proved guilt on their own, but together they told a story, and that story no longer matched reality. The detective allowed the inconsistencies to exist. He didn't correct them. He let the suspect hear himself. Because hearing your own lies spoken back to you is often more powerful than being accused. At some point, the suspect stopped trying to convince the detective. He started trying to convince himself. His voice lost its certainty. His explanations grew circular. He spoke, then corrected himself, then corrected the correction. The structure that had once held his story together was gone. The detective finally addressed the mistake directly, not as an accusation, as an observation. He reminded the suspect that the detail he had corrected had never been released. He asked again how the suspect could have known it. There was no longer any attempt at confidence. The suspect's answer was vague. He suggested possibilities without committing to any of them. But vagueness doesn't erase knowledge, and it doesn't explain certainty. Silence followed, longer this time. The suspect stared at the table. His hands rested flat against the surface, unmoving. This is often the moment people expect a confession, but confessions rarely happen like that. They don't arrive suddenly. They arrive gradually. The suspect began speaking again, not about the crime, about stress, about exhaustion, about feeling overwhelmed. These statements weren't admissions, they were justifications, and justifications are often the first step toward confession. The detective listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge. He simply allowed the suspect to continue. Eventually, the story shifted. The suspect stopped insisting on innocence. He began talking about intent, about things getting out of control, about moments that couldn't be taken back. The line between explanation and admission blurred. When the confession finally came, it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, fragmented, incomplete. But it didn't need to be perfect, because the evidence now aligned. The timeline, the knowledge, the mistake. The case no longer relied on one sentence. That sentence had simply opened the door. In court, the defense would try to explain it away. They would argue coincidence, misunderstanding, memory contamination. But juries understand something fundamental. People don't correct details they don't know, and they don't know details they weren't present for. The interrogation became the turning point of the case, not because of force, not because of intimidation, but because of human nature. Because people who believe they are smarter than everyone else eventually stop protecting themselves. They assume they've already won, and in that moment, they relax, they speak freely, they correct mistakes,
and they reveal what they know. Most people think crimes are solved by evidence alone. Sometimes they are, but just as often they are solved by behavior, by pauses, by certainty, by words spoken too quickly. Because the truth doesn't always fight its way out. Sometimes it simply slips through, quietly, in a single correction. And once it does, there is no taking it back.